Okay, so we have reached the question and answer section of this panel. And for those who maybe came in during the presentations or did not catch the introductory material, I'd like to introduce all of the speakers again, just briefly. So first we heard from me, Kyle Olson. I'm a PhD in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. We also heard from Brian Daniels, who is the Director for Research and Programs at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology's Cultural Heritage Center, and the Vice President of Cultural Heritage of the American Institute of Archaeology. We also heard from Hadi Ahmadi, who is the Director General of the Ministry of Cultural Heritage's Office for Heritage Preservation and Restoration, and he is here not on behalf of the government, but as an individual. We also heard from Leila Amina Dole, who's the founder of Amina Dole and Associates, who is a practicing art lawyer and legal scholar with a focus on art, cultural heritage, and intellectual property law. We're also joined by Carol Lee, who is an associate at Clifford & Chance. She's a specialist in US export controls, economic sanctions, and anti-corruption compliance, and is collaborating with the Heritage Management Organization on their OFAC application. We'll also be hearing from Evangelos Kyriakidis and Esfandiar Batman Galij from Heritage Management and Bourse and Bazaar, respectively. So the way that this is going to work is that we're going to speak for about 20 minutes. I have several prepared questions for each of our panelists, and then I would like to field some of the questions that have come up in the chat as well. So my first question is a sort of more general question that I'd like each of the panelists to respond to. And that is, could you please give us a concrete example of how American sanctions have affected your work, whether positively or negatively? And then if you are so inclined to also speak about concrete policies that you think would benefit your work vis-a-vis sanctions relief. So whoever wants to take a jump at that first, you're more than welcome, or I can call on people if we have a bit of a silence.
Sorry, I just lost your voice for a few seconds. Could you please repeat? Should I answer, or you will decide to who?
Yeah, Hadi, please. Actually, so specifically, I was kind of curious in your work about how the American sanctions have directly affected projects that you've been involved in, and if you could give us some technical details about the way that that's the impact.
As I told you before, the sanction have two kinds of effects on my job as a conservation. The direct effects on budget that usually provided by the government, by the state, which is in the shortage budget, because of sanction, affects directly to the conservation works. And the other effects, which is indirect, the low income of the sites, the museums, the private museums, even the state's museums, state sites, which is lower income, causes the lower invest. So in generally its effects, and the other effects I told you is about the cooperations and the joint missions and the other cooperation with the all the wars we had before, and also about the human resources, which is usually we have plenty of students who study abroad. In this situation, it's impossible. Another thing is tourists. You remember when the previous administration in United States announced that if anybody goes to Iran, probably some other countries, they cannot enter to the United States. It causes the people who, the professional travelers, the the tourists who just even they haven't planned to go to the United States, scared from it, that if they come to Iran and have the visa of Iran in their passport, never can go to the United States. And the all the activists in financial sector of the world always still they're scared to uh, get into trouble with any relation to Iran, even travel to Iran. So it's reduced the tourist income to Iran, which was on the road to increase. And we found new markets. And recently, just before the Trump administration, the increasing of income tourism in Iran was, it was very clear from United States, from the Canada, from Europe. We almost lost all of the potential markets after the sanction. I think it's enough, but there was some question in chat they sent to me if it's time to answer or later.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the participants asked me that how much fund we had from abroad before 2018. Actually, I don't have the amount, the number right now, but the other part of question was now it's how much is now? Now is zero. And who was some of them that I can remember? For example, the JICA, the German institution. We had some joint mission with the universities, even United States universities, European universities. We had joint mission in archaeology excavation. We had joint mission in conservation, restoration, running museums, joint exhibition in the other countries. Actually, now this cooperation is like zero. So another question was that effect of sanction on rock art. Actually, not rock art. Rock art is one of the studies maybe, but the sanction affects on all studies, all joint studies, or the foreigners' studies in Iran. Another question was about digitizing, which they recommend us that digitizing could work now. Yes, we are working on digitizing largely in process in Iran, but to be honest, it doesn't provide money fund for the conservation. But yes, digitizing both because of coronavirus and the sanction during the last years and now is in process. And I think I don't have any question more.
Yeah, thank you, Hadi. So Layla, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So in the one example I discussed in my video about the restitution of stolen property, I don't know if I would say it's as much sanctions, but more of the lack of communication between two governments. So in that case, with the return of the Persian Guard, we were extremely lucky that there was a researcher, Dr. Lindsay Allen, who was so knowledgeable about materials coming from Persepolis that raised a red flag about the work. And, she had contacted me and we had contacted the district attorney together. And the district attorney was very grateful for that tip because, the district attorney here in New York, Manhattan district attorney, had that office has the only unit devoted to arts and antiquities trafficking. So the DA, that office took a personal interest in the work. But that's different than how, normally these repatriations take place. Often a foreign government or law enforcement will cooperate with one another to have works returned. So we were really lucky in this case that it was a private individual. But that's really difficult because that's not really the burden that we want to place on researchers. And if there was cooperation between governments, between law enforcement agents, it would be, law enforcement in the US would be more effective in stopping the trade of looted or illicit artifacts entering into the US. So I think it's a really great example of a private individual who took great interest in the work and has pride in her work and wants to protect these objects. But it really, that whole process would be much easier and much more effective if there was exchange of information between US and Iranian officials.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you, Kyle. So what I would say here, especially in regard to sanctions, is that I think we're talking about a very specific set of policy considerations, at least in the US context. And I think that one of the things that has benefited cultural heritage preservation in Syria considerably, for example, is that there is very specific relief written into the sanctions themselves for projects that are engaged in cultural heritage preservation inside Syria. And there are certain kinds of rules of compliance that go with exercising that exemption. But we do not have similar parallel language for Iran that would enable the work of the management organization to continue on a regularized basis, or even would enable, I think, some of the cultural exchange by universities and museums that we've heard talked about so well today, and our colleague Hadi has certainly spoken to the need for. So what I would say is, knowing that the contextual work in the Syrian context and how that's benefited specifically from the sanction exemption, in answer to your question, Kyle, about what would be a good policy remedy here, I really would point to that very specific, the specific relief language regarding cultural heritage preservation, and trying to actually advocate that to be active for both Iran, but for other countries for which the US has sanctions as well.
Thanks, Brian. Carol?
Hi, this is Carol. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just be very quick here. So apologies, my internet has been very spotty today, so I just probably not ideal for me to turn on the camera. So there are very comprehensive sanctions by the United States against Iran. Basically, as many people know, the default rule is any activity involving Iran with US nexus is restricted unless there is an exception. So this may involve transfer of technology between US and Iran, or involving US person, US dollars. It is possible that general license on nonprofit activities may cover, but they require case-by-case analysis. So this is just a short comment here in this regard.
Great, thank you so much. So we have had a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to get to as many of them as I can in the next 10 minutes that we have for our open discussion. The first one that I want to answer, though, is one that I'll take on, which has to do with the question of how many sites are there on the Heritage Register in Iran. And this is, I think, a question that does have a concrete answer that Hadi may be able to give us a figure for with respect to the National Register of Monuments in Iran. But it's important to note that Iran has 24 sites on the UNESCO heritage list, and that is the 10th most in the world. So it's a pretty significant number. And I'll also say that Professor Ali Mousavi from UCLA recently gave a presentation at the Smithsonian about his digital online site gazetteer. So like an archaeological atlas of Iran, and his estimated figure is that there is a total of 300,000 monuments in Iran, of which I think approximately 30,000 have been registered. So that's 10%. But I guess to get to some of the other questions, so there's been a question about the relationship between intangible heritage and online platforms. In particular, the question was about dance, but I think also this question of social media and these different platforms that allow remote collaboration is very interesting. Hadi, maybe this one you could also speak to as well. I've seen a lot of activity from heritage professionals in Iran on Instagram in particular, like a lot of content. And then I think there's a very interesting question about the role of the United States in stimulating the demand for looted antiquities that Leila, you might want to speak to. And then another question that I think perhaps for Brian and for Carol has to do with the question of technology transfer and the effect of sanctions on the ability of people to transport materials that are required for archaeological and heritage research and restoration, conservation, et cetera. So I'll toss it back to the panelists. Go ahead, Hadi.
Yeah, you told about the number of the sites. Yeah, true. It's officially 34,000 sites and buildings is in the national list, which is 12,000 of them is archaeological sites. We almost have 300,000 sites, which is in the waiting list to add to the national list. About the world heritage site, as you told, yes, we are 10th in the world, is 24, but the site is 45 because some of the properties are the serial property, like the gardens, the canals, and the churches. I would like to add something. As Leila mentioned, and I forgot to tell you about one of the indirect effects of sanction is the illegal excavation, looting, and trafficking the antiquity, which is the consequence of the poverty kind of related to the sanction. And one more thing, one of our funny problem in conservation right now is that we have money officially, not in Iran, but in the maybe European banks, but we cannot pay our membership, UNESCO, World Heritage, to ICOMOS, to ICOM, because the way of transfer money is banned. So it's very funny in 2021 that a country cannot pay $40,000 of membership. Yeah, thanks.
Would you like me to go next, Kyle?
Yes, please.
So someone had asked about the role of the U.S. in the market for looted antiquities, and there are many academics who study in this field that state that the antiquities market the market for looted antiquities is demand driven, so that the more people who want these objects, the more incentive there is for looters to dig these up and put them on the market. And this is actually probably something Brian can address as well. I know he's done a lot of research in this area also. So if we want to look at this historically, there has been a demand for artifacts from Iran in the U.S. and in the Western, the European market for over a century now. And if this is one of the reasons that Iran did pass a patrimony law. There's writing on the fact that in the 1920s, it was very vogue and very in vogue, very popular for people to collect artifacts from Iran. So in the early 20th century, it was necessary for Iran to protect their heritage. And that's why the country did pass this patrimony law. But as I mentioned in my video, it's necessary for governments to cooperate and return objects that were stolen from Iran. And one of the things that I've seen, not necessarily in my work as an attorney, but in my work as an academic, is that there are some people who question whether or not we should return objects to Iran. I think it actually is irrelevant. I think some of these questions are improper, actually. We're talking about ownership when we're talking about legal ownership under a patrimony law. So does ownership vest in a country if an object is removed from that it was discovered in that country within their borders? And yes, it does by a patrimony law. And Iran has very clear patrimony laws that have been enforced. The nation actively, enforces these laws and has had this law, its first patrimony law, on the books for over 85 years. And when I've written or made some statements about Iran and the protection of its heritage, there are some people out there who say, well, why should we be protecting Iranian artifacts? It's a terrorist nation, or arguments like that come up that I think are irrelevant and disrespectful, and honestly just not relevant legally, because the law is clear that Iran owns these objects. But the U.S. does have a role in these objects coming in, because there is a market. They've been popular in the U.S. for generations now. So it's not just the U.S., but really any of these countries we call market nations, where there are nations that or people within these nations who are interested in collecting these objects. So I think the U.S. should be protecting these materials, or law enforcement at least cooperating or trying to return objects, like what was done in the Persian Guard relief case, just like they do for other countries, like they do with nations that we have good relationships with, that we have good diplomatic relations with, like Greece and Italy, France, Spain. These patrimony laws should apply to any country that have them. I don't know, Brian, maybe you want to mention some of the figures. I know you've done work on the ground in Syria and Iraq and looking at those markets. I haven't done that research to see the path that the objects take, but Brian, perhaps you have something to add.
Well, I can maybe just a little bit to that context. I mean, I think that Layla is absolutely right that the kind of market of illicit trafficking is demand driven. And I mean, I've looked at some of the figures, especially in a Syria and Iraq context. But I would also point out the work of a couple of scholars on the call here. I mean, Morag Kersel's work has been absolutely instrumental, and I've seen her on today, in pointing out the demand-driven nature of markets for illicitly looted antiquities generally, and also Neil Brody and Isper Sabrine, and I saw that we've had Isper with us today as well, who have really focused on what the demand side of the equation is. And I think that what we can point to in sort of broad summary is that there are certain kinds of categories of object in countries like the United States for which there is strong collector demand. And the market meets those specific interests for those specific classes of object. And so it's not even generic looting, that there's all sorts of looting and then that somehow filters into the market, but the demand for specific categories of object, like that Riton, for instance, drive the looting. And I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind here. Just in regard to Kyle's other question about the technology transfer, my experience and observation on this is that it's very specific to the specific sanction regime. And so what kind of waivers are required in order to be in compliance with the technical sanctions is something that is unique to the country-specific context. And what I would hope is that we could find ways for there to be a more technology transfer, especially in regard to heritage preservation in Iran, the same ways we were able to work out ways to do this in Syria.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for one last question, and this is a good one, and I'd like to hear from Carol specifically. So this came in, Tehran's Valley Asser Street is on the UNESCO waiting list, and its renovation, preservation of buildings and landscape is crucial to its bid to become a cultural heritage site. What about city-to-city relations? Can cities and municipalities connect independently from governments, at least in terms of knowledge transfer under the current sanctions regime?
Okay, so generally speaking, as I just mentioned, that any activity involving Iran with US nexus is restricted unless there is an exception. And as Brian just noted, there are certain license authorized involvement of US elements in a range of activities. So specifically for NGOs in Iran, including humanitarian projects to meet basic human needs, environmental and wildlife conservation projects, and human rights and democracy building projects are authorized. However, general license E, this is a general license E specifically, does not apply specifically to conservation of historical sites and objects and cultural preservations. With respect to city, it also requires analysis, like on a case by case basis.